let's start with the obvious.
Let's
Why
start
write a
with
book about Thanksgiving?
You know, it's funny because I mean, that's always the question. It's the obvious question about books, but it's also not the obvious question about books. So I didn't want to write a book about Thanksgiving. That seemed kind of limited in a sense. So, and some of that is just sort of a trick you play in your mind as a writer. I've always been fascinated with the holiday, but I've always felt really bad about the history of how the holiday has been presented to us. But the idea of gratitude on a personal level, and just as research into the field of a gratitude practice and awareness has grown, especially over like the last 10, 20 years, I just sort of started to see these different aspects come together. So I was fascinated by this woman, Sarah Hale, who thought, oh my God, we all have to celebrate Thanksgiving on the same day, right? Okay, because Thanksgivings used to be all over the place. There was not ever just like one Thanksgiving. There wasn't a first Thanksgiving. Thanksgivings were all over the globe. Various gratitude ceremonies have been going on since humans have been on the planet. But this woman just sort of dedicated a good chunk of her life to wanting to get the entire country to come together and say thank you on the same day, which I think is really interesting. The fact that a lot of the history of Americans' relationship to gratitude has been rooted in very, very difficult times was also something that really appealed to me. So I don't really do biographies, so I didn't want to write a biography about Sarah Hale. And I didn't want to write a book that said, hey, this is what Thanksgiving means. So I just sort of started off by just thinking about kind of what it meant to me as a person, and then went from there. So these different pieces came together, and I started to think of it as sort of a biography of an idea, as opposed to a particular person or a history of a particular event. It was just sort of like, let's look at American history, really, because this starts pre-George Washington. This starts, pre-colonial. Let's look at American history through the lens of giving thanks and how that has evolved over time and how I think it could still evolve.
No, I mean, I thought one clue as to what was on your mind was in this quote early in the book where you said, in the midst of strife and suffering, when violence and hatred can seem to dominate the news of the day, finding blessings, however small, can feel like an insurmountable, even Pollyanna task. Mm-hmm. I wondered when you wrote that.
Oh my God. Well, no,
Say about 2017, maybe?
No, that's the thing, is that so much of this book was about trying to find things to be thankful for when times just really are trying to make it impossible for you to find things to be thankful for. And writing a book titled We Gathered Together, I did not, that was not during the pandemic. So when I was actually editing this book, everything that I had written about the holiday, about gathering, about finding hope in times of difficulty took on an entirely other level of importance because we were in the middle of the pandemic. So it's all.
And this was when you're finishing the book. You turned it in.
I already turned it in, so we're editing and we're looking back over things, and that's when I did the epilogue, which was like where I actually talk about kind of that shift for me. And it's funny because when you, as you know, when you conceive of a book, that they're very long. They're in your even a book that's this is smaller than my usual one. They're in your life for a really long time. And sometimes they're rumbling around in your head for a long time before they ever end up on paper. And what you conceive of is one thing, and you're in a certain place and time. And then you're writing it and you're kind of in your cave. And then you are sharing it with a trusted editor. And then that's a whole other point in time. And then it's taken away from you essentially and put out into the world. And that world is always very, very different than the world in which you conceived the book and the world in which you wrote the book. But my gosh, I had no idea how much the world was going to change in between the time I was thinking about this and writing this and then actually running around and, well, not running around and talking about this, virtually talking about this. This is the first time I've walked around and talked about this. So,
So you did get to do, basically all the research except for the epilogue before the pandemic.
Yes.
So do you have any good stories about Sarah Josepha Hale and following her tracks? I mean, did you visit like where she used to live and stuff like that?
What I was trying to do when, so Sarah Josepha Hale is this amazing woman from the 18th and 19th century who, widowed mother of 5, who with no formal education, who ended up becoming one of the most powerful editors in the United States of America and a proponent of making Thanksgiving an actual formal holiday, which is something she petitioned people, all ambassadors and heads of territories and governors and all this, and presidents. And Abraham Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, is the one who eventually said, all right, let's do this, But like I said, I didn't want it to be sort of her biography. But what was fascinating about her, and she's obviously a big chunk of the book, although I would say like the last third of the book is mostly 20th and 21st century. She wrote so much. It was amazing to me how someone who was really kind of struggling to support herself and support her kids and make her way in the world after losing her husband to pneumonia. So many people did, in those days. That was a killer, still is. But she found time to not only do her own writing, but promote other people's writing, and often the writing of other women at a time when that just didn't happen that often. And the sheer output she was, it was stunning to me, it still is, how many magazine articles, editorials, books, collections, anthologies that she put out into the world that weren't just about her, that were mostly, other people's work. And so to me, it was her ability to kind of do that and put her focus, despite how much she needed to do for herself and her family, to still be able to find time to put her focus on others, I thought also spoke to the larger theme of the book. Because in addition to, the editing and Thanksgiving and all the rest of that stuff, she was always raising money for, wives and children who had lost sailors and people who had been being lost at sea. Her brother had been lost at sea, and she would raise money for what would have been, for veterans homes and libraries and orphans and monuments. And she was constantly, and she would go to her readers and say, like, just give this much. It was that whole idea, which became very popular in a lot of ways in the 21st century, about just give just a little bit of money. If everybody just gave a little bit of money, you could raise the kind of, she was sort of doing crowdfunding before anybody was thinking about it. And she would put in her little magazine, come on, folks, isn't it important to, help out these kids who've lost their fathers and these women who've lost their husbands? All you have to do is send, 20 cents. And she would raise thousands of dollars. And it was just, and right. And she was herself, working to make ends meet. She wasn't, without food or anything like that. So,
but you see, when she moved to Boston to take the magazine job, it seems like she gave up all of her children. She had 5 children, and 4 of them didn't, and they were all 14.
A couple went to go
14
stay.
and younger.
A couple went to go stay with. A couple went to school, and a couple went to go stay with another family member, and then and another came with her. And so she was constantly in touch with them, and they would come and go. But yeah, she had to make a lot of sacrifices.
What's so fascinating about her, she's just not what you think of as the 19th century woman, and she seemed very comfortable in that role. She doesn't seem to think of herself as a revolutionary. She just is who she is.
Yes. And in a lot of ways wasn't revolutionary in the way that 21st century people might want her to be. I mean, so she was living that she's in this very powerful editor and in charge of, you know, Godey's Ladies magazine. The magazine went through various names throughout, you know, the years. The massive circulation, some claimed the largest circulation in the United States at the time. And are they gone now? Okay. And you know, she was living this very revolutionary life for a woman in the mid 1800s, right? She's in charge of a magazine. She's, you know, controlling the fates of writers, not just women. I mean, she was one of the first publishers of, you know, Nathaniel Hawthorne. She was one of the first publishers of Edgar Allan Poe. She was very influential in Poe's life, actually. And yet, personally, she did not want to be a part of the suffrage movement, which was very, you know, very, very important, very active and very vocal at the time. And so she sort of, in that sense, she really was kind of her own person. That just wasn't how she chose to put herself out in the world. That wasn't how she chose to further change. She sort of did it on her own terms, which I think, you know, there's an appeal to that, I think, kind of going your own way.
And she wrote a little poem that people have probably heard of.
Oh my gosh, oh yes, then there's that.
If you haven't listened to the audiobook.
Yes. And I read it.
Denise does her own audiobook. So even if you have the book, it's fun to get the audiobook and listen to Denise, particularly when she reads the entirety of Mary's Lamb.
Mary's Lamb, which most of us
otherwise
grew up,
known as
Mary Had a Little Lamb. So
written by Sarah Josepha Hale.
Written by Sarah Josepha Hale. And you know, she wrote that while she was working as a school teacher. Published it in a small book of children's stories, and it just caught on and kept getting reprinted. And I think we're all quite familiar with Mary Had a Little Lamb.
And the interesting thing about the poem is if you read all the way to the end, it turns out to be a poem about kindness.
Yes.
It has a moral lesson.
It's a beautiful.
If you're kind to your lambs, something. People will be kind to you.
Be good to your lambs. Be nice to your lambs.
You guys do lamb.
So
it's a little clearer in the poem.
No, but you bring up a very interesting. You know, you're going through books, and it's like, what are you keeping? What are you not keeping? Do we all know Mary Has a Little Lamb? Do we have to have the whole thing in there? And me and my editor were like, we absolutely have to have the whole thing in there, because who thinks it's that long? It's actually quite lengthy, this poem, and it is lovely, and it really does speak to kind of what she furthered her entire life, which is come together, be unified, be kind. I mean, that was sort of her thing, and it came out, and that poem was well before she was established as an editor, and it grew in popularity after she sort of became sort of more of a more known and published entity. And she was, I mean, what's funny is, like, here was this woman who wore black the minute her husband died, and wore black the rest of her life, who, you know, had a magazine that had a bunch of, you know, high French fashion. And she was such a contradiction in so many ways. And, you know, she was a proponent, she essentially responsible for popularizing the idea of white wedding dresses, and helped to bring the concept of Christmas trees to the United States and popularize those. They're very early prints in the magazine she edited of the Queen Victoria, and that's standing in front of their Christmas tree.
I love her prediction about Queen Victoria.
Well, isn't that amazing? So she loved Queen Victoria, and when Victoria came to the throne, and I think Victoria was only about 18 or something, she wrote in her magazine, she said, we are going to speak about Queen Victoria years from now the way we spoke about we will talk about her age. And of course, we do all talk about Victorian age, very much so, to this very day. And I often think to myself, like, if she were alive, she would be a total like Instagram influencer. I mean, she was the ultimate influencer, but her influence was this ladies magazine that was read by hundreds of thousands of subscribers. But in that day and age, because magazines were really thick, and I actually did get, I have a bound copy of all the editions from 1863,
Wow.
which is pretty special, and one copy from 1830. And they stay in their plastic. I look at them. You know, because that was an expense, subscription rates didn't really tell the whole story, because you'd get a subscription, you'd read it, and then you'd go to your neighbor.
Right.
And they'd read it. And so people would pass, there was this big pass along readership.
I can tell you from working in magazines in the 1990s and 2000s, they still count pass rate.
Sure, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, don't forget the pass along readers too.
That's right.
That's right. So let's talk a little about Thanksgiving, because
It is in the book, yes.
growing up in the
It is actually in the book.
growing up in the Middle West, I didn't really have any religious association with Thanksgiving.
Yeah, right.
And it's amazing, well, it's amazing, it's kind of makes perfect sense that the holiday actually came from chiefly religious origins, that it was originally, give thanks to God. And although even when George Washington had his first proclamation of Thanksgiving and went to church on his designated Thanksgiving day, he said there weren't very many people.
There weren't very many people, but the word Thanksgiving, I mean, goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. The original concept of Thanksgiving was often associated with fasting and prayer and seclusion, but then sometimes followed a day or so after by a meal and sharing time with family and friends. What we consider Thanksgiving today is kind of an amalgamation of various, the original idea of Thanksgiving plus harvest rituals and those sorts of celebrations. So over hundreds of years, really, and the Thanksgiving started in Europe, and those grew out of other celebrations of annual celebrations of harvests and worshiping different gods and praying for rain and all of that sort of stuff. So I mean, all of this stuff has evolved over time for again, as long as we've been on the planet. But what we consider Thanksgiving is not similar to like the oldest, most traditional concepts of Thanksgiving, which were much more really kind of just much more staid and mellow and very, very serious. And but there were also Thanksgivings where you were supposed to practice fasting and humiliation was one of my favorite little phrases.
Fasting and humiliation.
Fasting and humiliation, that's right.
Did you humiliate anybody you wanted to? Or?
You could, I think you were supposed to just humiliate yourself, which, so that's kind of ran the gamut. But I mean, one of the reasons I love Thanksgiving. It's my favorite holiday. And I like the idea that at least now it's never for me had a religious connotation. And so it always sort of felt like everybody got to play. Everybody got to hang out.
Which brings us to Jane Austen. I love that there's an American author named Jane Austen, who is not the Jane Austen that we think of as the novelist, who wrote a book. What was it called? Standish of Standish.
Oh God, that's right. Yes.
Her name is Jane Austen.
I was like, you said Jane Austen, and I'm like, did I write about Jane Austen in this book? What are you talking about? Who wrote this book? Yes, exactly.
Right.
So yes, okay. So
it's all her fault.
It's partially, actually, I go back further than her. I go back to the guy who wrote, it was an article in a magazine called Our Young Folks, which was actually an offshoot of the Atlantic at the time. And this gentleman wrote, of course I'm blanking on his name, he wrote a very long article that was about a Thanksgiving celebration. And this was one of the this was in the 1865 or something. It's in the book, the right date is in the book, and it's in the notes. But it was shortly after the end of the Civil War. and talking about basically this sort of fanciful engagement of Thanksgiving, and Native Americans were present, and all of this sort of stuff. And then this woman, shortly thereafter, Jane Austen, not that Jane Austen, wrote Standish of Standish, which was
Jane L. Austen.
Jane L. Austen, Jayne, no, it wasn't, but Standish of Standish, and Standish on Standish, Standish of Standish, and talking about, of course, an extremely romanticized story about Miles Standish and the Pilgrims. And then out of those two magazine articles, and there was an article in Ladies, I think it was Ladies Home Journal, that also featured a piece of art that they had commissioned that took some of these more romanticized elements of this potential meal and put them in an image. And all of that stuff started to pile up and stick, and helped give us this idea that we have that there was this one event that kicked everything off, which I think is really interesting, because, you know, the Thanksgivings, and they still are proclaimed. Every year, a president makes a Thanksgiving proclamation, every single year. They did last year, year before, there will be another one this year. And, you know, no presidents ever, and they used to have to, you know, they would proclaim when Thanksgiving would be, because it wasn't a federal holiday until World War II. So president would say Thanksgiving's going to be this day in November, and then governors from different states would announce to their state, the president says Thanksgiving's going to be on this day, so Thanksgiving's going to be on this day, and they usually just sort of followed suit until World War II, when the various merchants were complaining about where Thanksgiving was falling. It was right before, it was in the late 30s, where Thanksgiving was falling, and that it was cutting into shopping time, and they wanted to move Thanksgiving Day. And, you know, there was even a year while Roosevelt was in office where half the country celebrated Thanksgiving on one Thursday. Well, almost half. The other almost half celebrated on the other on another Thursday in November. Several states celebrated both Thursdays and just took 2 weeks off, because there was no law that basically it was up to governors to follow suit with whatever the presidents were proclaiming.
So which president first brought the Pilgrims into it?
Roosevelt. That was FDR. So all of these Thanksgiving proclamations from, if you want to go all the way back to Washington, then we have our consistent streak of Thanksgiving proclamations, starting with Lincoln during World War II, during the Civil War. None of those mention Pilgrims until FDR. So they were never a part of the presidential proclamation of Thanksgiving. They were never a part of that sort of official story.
For a journalist, there's a thread running all the way through this book about bad journalism. About good journalism, you know, what journalism can do through Sarah Hale, you know, the power of journalism.
Right.
And on the other hand, can we talk about scissors editors? That's a whole other thing.
Clipping, yeah, sure.
People whose job it was to steal news from other sources and put it into their, anyway. So I love this quote from you, if I can find it. It's been clear from a survey of 19th century journalism books that Thanksgiving's history has always been challenging for the media. A bit of an understatement.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I grew up with the Pilgrims.
Sure, of course. Kids still do.
I'm sure they do.
Kids still do. But which is why next year, I have same time next year, there will be 2 other books joining this one. A picture book for young kids and a young readers book for like middle school aged kids that are going to be the same story, but age appropriate.
What do they call?
That's still up. That's still up in the air.
It's too soon. Too soon.
Yeah.
I mean, when you talked about the last third of the book being more recent, just because of the way the book is structured, it seems like Sarah Josepha Hale dies and then Thanksgiving just goes to hell. It's about when she dies that they start playing football and
Having parades.
having parades
Yeah.
and turns into a
Bringing
shopping
Santa
season.
into it. Yeah. But what's interesting to me is her tenacity. I mean, here was somebody, and you talk about her being prescient with regard to like white wedding dresses and Queen Victoria and all of these other sorts of things, that she was such an amazing influencer of the culture. She said, she was so thrilled when Lincoln said, yes, I would proclaim, the entire, country's going to come together. I'm going to do it every year. The entire country's going to come together and we're going to have Thanksgiving on this day. And then, she kept petitioning, as long as she was alive, she kept petitioning every successive president till it became a ritual. It became something that happened every year. But she said before she died, and she wrote about it in her magazine, it's not enough. This has to be a federally enacted holiday. This has to be in the congressional record. This has to be something that is established. We only have 2 holidays. We only have, 4th of July.
That's right. I love the
and
fact that there are 2 holidays that she mentions are Washington's birthday.
Washington's birthday and the 4th of July. She said, that's it. Yeah.
No
She
Easter.
said, we need another one. She goes, this needs to be an official United States holiday. And she never lived, she never lived, even came close to living to see that. Because again, that didn't happen until World War II. But to me, that's one of those things where you just never know. I'm sure she'd be flabbergasted to see the effect she's had on American culture.
Right.
She'd be, it's amazing to think about, what do we do or what do we not do in our lives, and that, will have, ripples through time, really.
So we've got about 10 minutes left.
Before questions, yes.
We're going to do what I call the lightning round,
Oh, God.
where I ask silly questions based on the book and see what we get.
Oh, boy. All right.
Well, I'm going to start with a semi-serious one because I did want to know if you knew about the studies showing that the expression of gratitude had actually measurable health benefits.
That was one of the reasons. Yes, I did. Okay, so I told you I didn't want to write a biography of Sarah Josepha Hale. And I didn't just want to write a book about, Thanksgiving in general. I wanted it to have something new. I wanted gratitude to be the overall theme. And I wanted the idea of actually returning the holiday to just whatever your expression of gratitude is. Keep your turkey, keep your cranberry, have a vegan turkey, I don't care. But like focusing on the gratitude as opposed to the pilgrims. So when I came across a couple of, I actually was reading and came across this, I don't even remember which, Psychology Today or something. I was like, that's really interesting. And I started looking, and I was working on, I was working on a play at the time. And I kind of went down the rabbit hole and started looking at all these different things. And I was like, that's the missing piece for this book. So actually coming across that research, that there were so many people, neuroscientists and people everywhere studying measurable effects in labs about, how your brain actually reacts to a gratitude practice. That to me is what made me say, okay, I'm going to do this book.
So that was a foundational element.
Absolutely, yes.
More important, what's the matter with your mother's stuffing?
Oh my God. So my mother, and she's no longer with us. She was an amazing cook. She was a spectacular cook. But she, like a lot of, she was Italian American, and there was a certain amount of like, this is how you're supposed to do American Thanksgiving, and she put liver and raisins in her stuffing, which is a lot of people, you people know people who've done that, right? No? Wow, I've seen actually a lot of people shaking their heads. I've known a number of people who've done this. Raisins I've seen a lot. Liver, thank you for nodding, Christopher, I appreciate that. And I didn't like it. I didn't like the way it tasted. So I would get it would be in the tray coming out of the oven, and I'd go to the little crispy parts in the corner and try and pick them out and scrape off like the liver and the raisin part and like hoard them and then cover them with gravy so that no one could see that I had sort of dissembled the stuffing.
What kind of stuffing do you make now?
I like making a stuffing with just basically really just sage from my garden, celery and lovage from my garden. A mix, I don't do cornbread, I do a mix of cornbread and some other sort of like a French roux. And lots of herbs, and sausage and fennel. Fennel's the key. I love the fennel. Fennel's a biggie.
Next lightning round question. Have you
Yeah.
tried Lafayette ducks with snowballs?
I have not, but I want to make them. So there are a number
I will
of,
repeat that. It's Lafayette ducks with snowballs.
and they're not ducks. And that reminds me that Lafayette ducks with snowballs, neither ducks nor snowballs. Discuss. So Sarah Josepha Hale, Mrs. Hale's receipts, as they called recipes back in the day. She, in addition to publishing all of these recipes in her magazine, she also published a number of recipe books. And the Lafayette, the ducks with the snowballs was a biggie. I haven't done it, but I kind of feel like I'm going to do it this Thanksgiving and film it and embarrass myself.
So what was your Thanksgiving like last year, Joe?
I cooked a ton because I love making, I don't know how long we ate turkey. Probably, how long did we eat turkey? My God, that's weird.
Same, yeah.
My God, I do a Madeira gravy for my turkey. I get my turkey from Hickory Nut Gap. I've already ordered my turkey for this year. I ordered my turkey ahead of time from Hickory Nut Gap. And I did everything. I did my favorite cranberry
Just the two of you.
sauce. Yeah.
I think we did the same thing.
Yeah,
Just
I did
the
a
two of you.
massive, I was like, I am doing the whole thing. I watched the parade, I put on my jammies, I made all of the food, and it was in the fridge I took a picture of the fridge, it was ridiculous. It was like that until like, oh my God, it's time to make lasagna for Christmas. It went on and on and on and on. It was unbelievable. I can do any turkey tetrazzini, turkey soup, leftover white bean turkey chili. Yeah.
You could be checking your Facebook page for these
Oh.
Thanksgiving recipes.
Oh yeah.
Post Thanksgiving.
Oh yeah.
I remember that was a big thing in the newspaper. It's like, all right, Thanksgiving's over.
What are you gonna do
with
now?
the- What are we gonna do with when are we gonna publish the recipes for using your leftover turkey?
Maybe I'll do that this year.
I just wanted to bring up a figure who appears later in the book, Thomas Nast, because he's the illustrator who sort of popularized the image of Columbia as the symbol for the nation. And if you haven't Googled those illustrations, you really need to. It seems like a fascinating figure.
And what Thomas Nast was, and his illustrations in and around the Civil War and afterward, as America started to change a great deal, captured a lot of what he was thinking. But as a political cartoonist, it was unbelievable what he did. And the idea of Columbia, as in District of Columbia, and Columbia was the representation of essentially the United States before Uncle Sam became popular.
Actually, a
one
man
of
had to
the-
displace the woman.
One of the earliest, Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved woman who was a poet, and actually wrote about Columbia in a poem and sent that poem to George Washington. She's one of the earliest people to have ever actually written about Columbia in any way, shape, or form. And you can actually see Phyllis Wheatley's poem and her letter to Washington. It's been scanned now by the National Archives. You can actually see it online.
So that's the end of our lightning round. But just
Oh, thank God.
just to end on a more serious note before we get to questions. What fascinates me about the traditional Thanksgiving that we all share, that we all were indoctrinated with when we were kids, the Pilgrim Thanksgiving, is it seems like people are trying to rescue the Pilgrim Thanksgiving and make it okay.
Sure.
Which just can't be done. You can't have a Pilgrim Thanksgiving and not have it be about the displacement and murder of indigenous people. It's just that's just what it leads to. You can't disentangle it.
No.
But if you go back to what Sarah Josepha Hale was proposing for Thanksgiving, you don't have that problem.
That's right. No, I mean, that's the thing is like, if you actually go, that's another, there was a version of this book, and I mentioned the Pilgrims when we get to Roosevelt. I jump back and talk
Right.
about how, because up to then you've just read it, because what I wanted to do was just like, here's a story about gratitude and giving thanks. And then you get all the way and you're like, oh, we haven't talked about the
I was
Pilgrims
going to
yet.
point out, you do this nice little survey of all the previous Thanksgiving celebrations and sort of pass right over the Pilgrims thing. Wait a minute, didn't 1621, Matt?
Yeah, but there were so many other things before then and so many other things after then. And you see the tradition become established without them, which is what happened. And then it's like, oh yes, but here's how they kind of crept into the story. But there was a version I thought of, considered doing of this book, which didn't mention the Pilgrims at all, because it is very possible to tell a story of giving thanks in the United States, or anywhere on the globe for that matter, giving thanks globally as well as giving thanks nationally. It's very easy to tell an accurate, true story of how this Thursday in November came about. It has nothing to do with Pilgrims.
Right.
And you're being totally accurate. You're not, you're not leaving out the most important parts. And so we can actually go back to that.
That seems like a good goal.
We could try.
Before we get to everybody else's questions, I have one that I have to ask you. Why Thursday? I mean, George Washington
Yeah, why did he
picked
choose a
Thursday.
Thursday?
Why Thursday?
I don't know. That's a really great question.
Did George Washington know that everybody's just going to call in sick on Friday?
George Washington, father of the 4-day weekend. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, she wanted to choose Thursday because Washington had chosen Thursday, and her father had fought in the Revolutionary War and been injured, and she was that was her.
So we just don't know.
Yeah, that was just Washington's random. Yeah, Thursday.
Because George said so.
Because George said so. Yeah.
So do we want to start with?
Yes,
Question-
Katie's going to be
virtual
awkward
questions?
and do things. So.
I'll start with the people who are here. Questions?
All right, so audience questions first, and then I'll ask the questions from our online friends.
I asked all the good questions I know, but we'll be some.
You did ask. Yeah, you did ask. You really did.
You
You.
love when somebody comes in with like this many Post-its in your book and like, oh my God, what's coming?
Right. Mhm.
All right, do we have an online question?
We do have an online question,
Fantastic.
and it's actually one that you just briefly talked about. How were the Native Americans addressed in these proclamations, or Hale's thoughts on Thanksgiving? That's from Patricia C. Dugan.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Hale did not talk a great deal about Native Americans, although her contemporaries, including notably Linda Maria Child and others, did. And actually kind of, and I talk about other female writers at the time who were very vocal about Native peoples, or Indians as they called them at the time, and also enslaved peoples and suffrage, who were a lot more sort of vocal about that than Hale was. And so that is in the book through those voices primarily. As you move further into the 20th century, you do start to have presidents mention the contributions of Native Americans and indigenous peoples. And actually, in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a huge movement to address everything that was inaccurate and exploitive about the holiday. And there was actually some progress made on some of those fronts, but it just didn't quite, catch on in elementary school.
Right.
And
then Reagan became president.
And yeah, so it's so you do start to get proclamations as the plight of the of the Native Americans became more evident and more discussed on a national level, that started to be more reflected in the Thanksgiving proclamations. And in the book, I actually include quotes from proclamations made by Kennedy, actually a report done on the education of young Native American individuals that was actually done by Senator Ted Kennedy, protests that were held at Plymouth in 1970, 1971, 1972, how that was covered. And you can see how that sort of evolves over time. And I actually found that one of the more interesting aspects of the book to research, to look at how all those things started to come to light. And then the further you move into the 20th and then the 21st century, pretty much all of the presidents do start to mention the contributions of indigenous peoples, Native Americans, and of all Americans in their Thanksgiving proclamations. And the proclamations themselves are very fascinating to read, and you can read all of them online at like the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, at the National Archives. These are all there, and they're very interesting because a lot of times presidents would use them to kind of put forth, we're thankful for X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z would have been like some policies that they had managed to get through. And you know, so they were very interesting. It was interesting the way the Thanksgiving proclamations were used at times. And it was what I did not know before starting to do this is like, you know, the Cherokee Nation issued Thanksgiving proclamations that followed, like, you know, Benjamin Harrison issues his, you know, proclamation, and then, you know, the chief of the Cherokee Nation says, you know, in accordance with, you know, our father, President Harrison, blah, 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 we blah, blah. And so you see these proclamations coming from something like the Cherokee Nation on the heels of a Thanksgiving proclamation issued by the President of the United States, while the nation was fighting to hold on to their land. And the things that they would say they were thankful for were also like kind of stating what they hoped they would be able to continue to be thankful for, meaning like holding on to their lands and their property and all of that sort of stuff. So
If you want to hold on to that thought, don't read the book.
yeah, so, and that doesn't go terribly well.
It doesn't go well.
It doesn't go well for them. But so to me, the whole concept of the proclamations, the ones that did talk about Native Americans, the ones that did not talk about Native Americans, the ones issued by the Native Americans themselves, it was all very, that to me was one of the aspects of the book that was very kind of very surprising and just sort of very layered and not what I was expecting. So thanks for that question.
Thank you, Patricia. Out on the internet.
Thanks, sorry, I'm looking, I'm like, this is so weird. Thank you. Hello, screen. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello, Stick. Does anybody else have an audience question? We have an audience question.
Is there like a time or an era where like the whole Turkification of Thanksgiving happened, or was it kind of always?
Did you say Turkification? That's fantastic. I do get into the food. I do get into the food history. Sarah Joseph Hale was obsessed with food. A lot of that idea, I mean, there are elements of what we eat, especially that do go all the way, but prior to, again, there were people living on this continent a long time before the Europeans showed up, and they were eating turkey, and they were eating fowl, and they were eating oysters, and they were cranberries were a noted source of vitamin C, and they stored very well, without refrigeration. I mean, so a lot of the things that caught on because early European settlers, whether they were French or English or Dutch or whomever. They learned those from the Native Americans and started, just using them themselves and eating them themselves and storing them themselves. And, that's, so the Turkification, getting a big juicy fowl, that goes way back, but not necessarily just to any particular Thanksgiving, but definitely if you were going to have a celebratory meal or some sort of meal for a lot of people, you know, having turkeys were running around. Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey to be the, you know, the state bird. I think they're beautiful. We have them all over in Nashville. They run all, I think they're gorgeous.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Turkification.
Another audience question?
I have a question.
Yes.
What was your favorite thing to discover, either a piece of information or an actual physical document or letter or what have you, when you were doing the research?
Favorite thing to discover. Favorite thing to discover. Oh my God, that's always so hard.
I know, sorry.
There was, I actually came across, got a copy of, a lot of times it's very, you can see references to certain documents in very, very old books. But sometimes a really interesting place to do research are auction booklets, because people will auction off their collections of letters or photos or maps or Americana or whatever, and actually got a copy of a book. It wasn't about her. She was like kind of like a little footnote in it, but it had a list of all, and those things are gone. But the auction booklet talks about what existed. So while you couldn't, those other things, I think were lost in a fire or something, but while you couldn't get your hands on these other items, this auction booklet went into extreme detail about, you know, a letter from, you know, Sarah Josepha Hale, from Charles Dickens to Sarah Josepha Hale, or from, you know, various people. She corresponded with Poe and his mother. I mean, she was a big factor in their life till his death. You know, one of my favorite stories was actually coming across her son David went to West Point, and very early on in her career, she was going out of her way to try and find up and coming writers. You had mentioned scissors editors. So it was very common, especially in the mid 1800s, that a magazine would really be, you would clip things that had been published elsewhere and read, almost kind of like and just reassemble them. And you'd say like, hey, here's our version of what we think you should be reading, but you scissored this stuff from other places. And when she got into editing, she was like, I want original work. I want stuff from people who are writing. And she was very picky about it. So she writes about this young up and coming writer in her magazine. She's doing a review of his work, and she says, he wants a bit of this, and he's lacking in that, blah, 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 but, shows great promise and potential genius, blah, blah, blah. So she gets this letter from her son, David, at West Point. And he said, I showed what you said about my classmates. I saw what you wrote about my classmates' work. And I showed it to him. And Edgar was it was Edgar Allan Poe. He was very encouraged. And so she was one of the first people to ever publish Edgar Allan Poe, and actually published The Cask of Amontillado.
I know, you just don't
in her ladies magazine.
Mary
And
had a
like,
little lamb and a casket.
exactly. So you have like, oh, here's the latest fashion. Here's a new word from France. Lingerie. And over here, someone is getting walled up in a crypt.
Yeah.
So have at it, ladies. And you just imagine these ladies in their parlor being like, "Ooh, my goodness!" And
Speaking of fiction, you have to have read her book, right? Northwood, did you read it?
yeah, it's a biggie.
Should we read it? And can we read it?
You can. Oh my God, yeah, you can. I mean, thank God for the New York Public Library. But also our wonderful library right here. You can always borrow books from other libraries and have them brought here, and that's a wonderful thing. She wrote this book, Northwood, and then did a reissue of it about 20 some odd years after it came out, of Life North and South. And it was one of the first books to ever talk about slavery in the South. And she kind of compared two different households, a household in New England and a household in the South. And this is long before Uncle Tom's Cabin came out. And she, she gives a description, and it's in these books that she starts to give descriptions of Thanksgiving meals.
Right.
And she gets into, the description, it's like a chapter long of Thanksgiving, how to set the table, where you put, where you set things, all the different kinds of pickles and all the different, it's unbelievable. It puts Martha Stewart to shame, and I'm a big Martha fan.
So you can do an audiobook of that, do an audio version of Northwood.
Oh my God, well, that whole section should just be its own little mini recipe book, I think.
All right, any more audience questions? We have one.
Yes, the man in the orange.
Oh, no.
Do we have any gravy in the fridge?
There is one last virtual question, and it was actually from Stephanie, and she wanted to know more about the tea if she could.
Oh, yes.
The tea.
Oh, yes.
Yes,
All right.
the tea.
So I can chat. They sell this here at Malaprops. So this is Gather Together, a gratitude blend. And this is a limited edition custom tea. It was a collaboration between myself and the amazing people at the Asheville Tea Company. Uses local ingredients, and it pairs with the book. And you can get it from their website, and you can get it here in Malaprops, and you can get it in some other bookstores. It was just released. One of the key ingredients is an herb called yaupon, which has a very long history with Indigenous peoples, especially in this part of the country. So we definitely wanted that to be a part of the blend. And it's delicious, and Asheville tea is amazing, and they're great to local farmers, and they're great to the community, and it was just really fun to be able to do that. Who doesn't want to sip some tea and read a book?
Yes, in addition to yaupon, it has pumpkin, cardamom, hibiscus, ginger, and cinnamon.
Mhm.
It's like Thanksgiving in a cup.
It's like Thanksgiving. It's like Thanksgiving in a cup, and it is very yummy, and
And
Yeah.
where's it available?
it's available at Asheville Tea Company, which is, I think, AshevilleTeaCompany.com, AshevilleTeaCo.com. It is available right here in Malaprops. So
Makes
you
it
have,
very
if you're
cute.
looking for what to give your little fellow book club members for the holidays, you get them a little book and a little matching tea. It's also, I don't think the link's on the best place to get it is from Asheville Tea Company or here at Malaprops, or if you're a couple other different cities that I'm going on tour to. Some of the indie bookstores are going to be offering it and ordering it. And if anybody out there is a bookseller or a retailer, they have wholesale options. You just go to Asheville Tea Company's website and they can hook you up. Yeah. Thank you, Stephanie.
Alrighty, so that is going to conclude tonight's event. Everyone, please give them a huge round of applause. Lots of tea for sale. You can say hello to the door guy, Brian, as you remember.
We all call him the door guy.
Call him the door guy. He will appreciate that, and he'll murder me later. It's fine. We also have backstock of Denise's other books available for sale and extra copies of We Gather Together.
It's okay.
I know.
Oh, my boots, I forgot to show
Oh, yeah,
my
your boots.
fancy bookstore, my book top boots. I don't even know if we're still broadcasting.
So if you'd like,
Can you sign with them? That would be.
Yes.
you sign with your, like,